Out of the blackness of a South Pacific night, it came. A sound the Japanese night bombers had learned to fear. It wasn't the frantic scream of a diving Hellcat or the familiar bark of anti-aircraft guns. This was something new. Something predatory. For the pilot of that Japanese bomber, there was no warning. No tracers arcing up from the ground to give him a chance to evade. One moment, he was shrouded in the safety of absolute darkness, a ghost on the wind. The next, his world was a fireball. What hellish weapon had the Americans unleashed? The Japanese high command never saw it coming. They had written off American technology as clumsy, derivative, and utterly outmatched. They believed their pilots, their samurai of the sky, owned the night. It was a fatal miscalculation. An arrogance that would be torn to shreds by a jet black widow, spinning her web in the darkness, and by a secret weapon they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and could never comprehend. Welcome, everyone, to a story of American ingenuity, of a triumph born from desperation and forged in the crucible of a war we were losing. This is the story of how a terrifyingly beautiful aircraft, the P-61 Black Widow, and a miraculous piece of technology, radar, came together to turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. And how the Japanese Empire's utter contempt for American technical skill became the very reason for their downfall. Imagine it's 1943. For the average American soldier and Marine fighting their way from island to island, the night did not bring rest. It brought terror. The Japanese, masters of night infiltration and attack, owned the darkness. Their bombers, like the Betty and Sally, would drone overhead with impunity, bombing airfields, harassing supply lines, and shattering sleep with the constant, grinding anxiety of imminent death. Our boys on the ground called it Washing Machine Charlie or Louis the Louse. These weren't affectionate nicknames. They were the names given to a tormentor who seemed utterly untouchable. Our daytime fighters, the brave P-38 Lightnings and the rugged F-4F Wildcats, were blind as bats once the sun went down. Sending them up was a suicide mission. They'd be chasing ghosts, their pilots straining their eyes until they saw phantom shapes in the gloom, all while burning precious fuel. The anti-aircraft gunners on the ground? They were firing blindly into a black void, illuminating the sky with flak that almost never found its mark, their tracers looking less like defensive fire and more like a desperate, futile light show. The Japanese knew this. They relied on it. In their doctrine, their culture of the warrior, night fighting was a skill for the brave, the elite, the man with superior senses and spirit, the Yamato Damashii. They believed it was a realm where American gadgetry and what they saw as our soft, decadent reliance on technology couldn't help us. They thought they were untouchable. They were wrong, because while they were counting on American blindness, a small team of brilliant, unorthodox engineers and designers in a Northrop factory in California were building a Predator specifically designed to see in the dark. They were building the world's first dedicated, radar-equipped night fighter. They were building the Black Widow. And this is where our story begins. Not with a bang, but with a blueprint. With a radical idea that would give the United States Army Air Force's eyes in the eternal, crushing darkness of the Pacific night. To understand just how revolutionary the Black Widow was, you have to feel the desperation of those early war years. After the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was reeling. In the Pacific, it was a litany of disasters. The fall of the Philippines, the crushing defeat at Java Sea, the relentless advance of the Japanese war machine through Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The Allies were on the back foot everywhere. And in the air, the myth of Japanese invincibility was being written in fire. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a shock to the system. It was nimble, it had an incredible range, and its pilots were veterans hardened by years of war in China. Our pilots, flying aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk and the F-4F Wildcat, found themselves in a brutal calculus. You couldn't turn with a zero. It would outmaneuver you every time. Your only hope was to use your heavier aircraft's advantages, diving speed and ruggedness, in slashing hit-and-run attacks. It was a dangerous, deadly game. But the night was a whole different kind of hell. Let's zoom in on one place, a microcosm of this nightly torment, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, late 1942. Picture yourself as a young Marine, dug into a foxhole half filled with water. You're exhausted, your body aching from a day of repelling bonsai charges and enduring mortar fire. The night should be your respite. But then you hear it. First, a faint, mosquito-like buzz on the horizon. Then it grows. The unmistakable, irregular sputter of a single-engine Japanese bomber, a washing machine Charlie. He's up there, alone, just one plane. But he holds the entire airfield in a state of suspended terror. He'll circle for hours. The air raid sirens wail. You can't sleep. You can't relax. Every few minutes, he cuts his engine, glides silently, and then you hear the whistle of a bomb. It might hit the runway, it might hit the supply dump, it might land right on your company's position. It's random. It's psychological warfare. And it's infuriatingly effective. On the ground, a gunner named Joe, let's call him, is peering through the sights of his 90mm anti-aircraft gun. The searchlights slash through the darkness, fingers of light desperately trying to grasp the elusive Charlie. For a second, they catch him, a silvery glimpse at 10,000 feet. The guns roar, the concussions pounding your chest. Tracers, beautiful and deadly, spiral up towards the target. But Charlie just banks slightly, slips out of the light and disappears. The guns fall silent. The waiting begins again. This was the reality. The Japanese owned the night. It was a fact as certain as the sunrise. Their confidence was sky-high. In their diaries and after-action reports, they wrote of these missions as near-training exercises. A nuisance raid to keep the Americans tired. They felt no real threat. Their arrogance was, in that moment, completely justified. But back in Washington, and in the halls of the Army Air Forces, the message was clear. We need a solution. We cannot cede the darkness to the enemy. The British were having success with their night fighters, like the Bristol Beaufighter, using early radar sets to hunt German bombers over London during the Blitz. The technology was nascent, finicky, but it worked. The United States needed its own. And it needed it yesterday. The request went out for a dedicated night fighter. It had to have the range to patrol for hours, the firepower to destroy a heavily built bomber in a single pass, and most importantly, it had to carry a crew, a pilot and a dedicated radar operator to manage the complex new equipment that would be its eyes. This was a radical departure from the single-seat fighter ethos. It was a team, a hunter-killer pair, going up into the abyss. The contract landed on the desk of Jack Northrop. And Jack Northrop was a man who didn't think in increments. He thought in leaps. If you were to see the P-61 Black Widow for the first time, you'd be struck by two things. First, its sheer, menacing beauty. It was all black, from its pointed nose to its twin tail booms. It was big. With a wingspan of 66 feet, it was larger than a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. It looked less like a fighter and more like a destroyer meant to stalk the void between the stars. And second, you'd notice its name. The Black Widow. A spider that lures its prey, mates, and then, it was a name meant to instill fear. And it was perfect. Jack Northrop and his chief engineer, Vladimir Pavleka, didn't just design an airplane. They designed a weapons system. Every single element was purpose-built for one thing. Finding, chasing, and killing the enemy in total darkness. Let's break down this masterpiece of engineering. First, the power. Two massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double WASP radial engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower. These were the same engines that powered the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt and the F-4U Corsair. This gave the Black Widow speed, over 370 miles per hour, but also the power to carry its heavy payload. And what a payload! The firepower was simply devastating. Mounted in its belly was a remote-controlled turret with 4.50 caliber machine guns. But the real party piece was in the wings, 420mm Hispano cannons. Let me put that in perspective for you. A single 20mm shell is about the size of a banana, and it's packed with high explosives. The Black Widow could fire 4 of these, along with a hail of .50 caliber rounds, all at once. When a Black Widow opened fire, it wasn't a strafing run, it was an execution. The concentrated firepower was designed to literally saw a bomber in half. And it often did. But all this speed and firepower was useless if you couldn't find the target. And that's where the secret weapon came in. The magic. The thing the Japanese never, ever expected. Radar. The Black Widow was built around the SCR-720 airborne interception radar. This wasn't some small add-on. The massive radome looked like a tiny submarine's conning tower grafted onto the plane's nose. Inside that radome, a magnetron sent out invisible radio waves, scanning the sky ahead. The returning signals were displayed on a green, glowing screen. A cathode ray tube, in front of the radar observer, or R/O, who sat behind the pilot. Now, imagine you're that R/O, a guy like, say, Sergeant John Simmons. You're hunched over your scope, a hood over your head to block out the ambient light. The world is reduced to that glowing green circle. On it, you see a blip. A little peak of light. That's your target. It's 10 miles out at 12,000 feet. You're the eyes. You talk the pilot onto the target. Adopt a calm, technical radio voice. Pilot from R/O. I have a contact. Bearing 10 degrees, range 9 miles, slightly high. Come left to 355. The pilot, let's call him Lieutenant Jack Cox, responds, banking the big aircraft smoothly. Roger, coming left to 355. You watch the blip on your screen get closer. 8 miles. 7. 6. The tension is electric. You're flying on instruments, in pitch black, trusting completely in the man in the back seat and this miraculous box of tricks. Range 5 miles. Dead ahead. You should be visual soon. The pilot strains his eyes, scanning the blackness ahead. Nothing. Nothing. Then a faint shadow against the slightly less dark sky. A speck. A silhouette. R/O from pilot. Tally-ho. I have him. The Betty. Switching to guns. The R/O's job is done. Now it's the pilot's. He pushes the throttles forward, the twin wasps roar with newfound urgency, and the black shape of the Widow surges forward, closing the distance like a shark accelerating for the kill. This partnership, this man-machine symbiosis, was something the Japanese had no concept of. Their doctrine was based on the keen eyes of a single pilot. They had no answer for an enemy that could see them from 5 miles away, through cloud, through rain, through the perfect cover of night. The Black Widow was more than a plane. It was a revolution. But as with all revolutions, its birth was fraught with trouble. The early models were buggy. The radar sets were temperamental. The engines overheated. The Army Air Forces, desperate for anything, looked at this complex, expensive, unproven bird and wondered, is it too much? Is it too complicated? Can our boys even fly this thing? The P-61 had its doubters, even on its own side. And as the first squadrons began their long journey to the Pacific, they carried not just the hopes of a military, but the weight of a radical, untested idea. Could this Black Widow really spin a web strong enough to trap the demons of the night? So, by mid-1944, the pieces were on the board. In one corner, the Japanese, confident, battle-hardened, their nightly raids a well-oiled routine of terror. Their superiority was a given, a truth they held to be self-evident. And in the other corner, slowly, secretly, the 421st Night Fighter Squadron is packing its crates. The first of the Black Widows is being disassembled, loaded onto ships, and sent on the long, perilous journey across the Pacific. The pilots and radar operators, a new breed of airmen, are studying their manuals, running simulations, trying to master this incredibly complex machine. They are the pioneers, the test subjects. They know the stakes. They arrive in the theater, and the first reactions from the other units are skeptical. The ground crews and the daytime fighter jocks take one look at this huge, black, twin-boomed monster and scoff. You're going to fight Zeros in that? It's a bomber. They'll eat you for breakfast. The Widow's pilots just smile. They know something the others don't. They aren't here to fight Zeros in a turning dogfight. They're here to fight a different kind of war. The first P-61s are reassembled on a dusty airstrip in New Guinea. The ground crews work round the clock, learning the new systems, dealing with the unfamiliar engines, wrestling with the mysterious and sensitive radar equipment. It's a steep learning curve. There are malfunctions, engine failures, radar sets that just decide to quit for no reason. The Japanese, Charlies, continue their nightly raids, completely unaware that their reign of terror is about to be challenged. They fly with their navigation lights on, some of them, so sure are they of their invulnerability. It's the ultimate insult. It's the height of arrogance. And then the night comes. The night chosen for the first combat patrol. A single Black Widow, its engines ticking as they cool, sits at the end of the runway. The crew, pilot and radar operator are going through their final checks. Their hearts are pounding. This is it. All the theory, all the training leads to this moment. The pilot looks over at his R/O. "You ready to go hunting?" The R/O gives a thumbs up, a grin barely visible in the red glow of the cockpit lights. "Let's go see if this thing works." The tower clears them for takeoff. The pilot pushes the twin throttles forward. The roar is deafening. The big black bird starts to roll, gathering speed, its weight feeling heavy, sluggish. Then it breaks ground, climbing slowly, deliberately, into the inky blackness of the Pacific night. It turns, and its navigation lights are extinguished. It vanishes. Down below, the Marines in their foxholes hear a new sound mixed with the familiar drone of Charlie. A deeper, throbbing rhythm. They look up, but see nothing. Just darkness. But up there, in that darkened cockpit, a green screen is glowing. A radar observer is scanning, searching. Somewhere out there, a Japanese bomber pilot is cruising, complacent, confident in his ownership of the night. He has no idea he is being hunted. Radar operator Theo, pilot from R/O. "I've got something, a faint blip. Bearing 280. Range 12 miles. Angels 11. That voice, crackling through the pilot's headset in the pitch-black cockpit of a P-61 Black Widow over New Guinea, was the sound of a revolution. For the crew of that aircraft, it was the culmination of years of training and desperate hope. For the unsuspecting Japanese bomber pilot cruising blindly ahead of them, it was the first whisper of his doom. Last time, we set the stage. We felt the terror of the night, the arrogance of an enemy who believed the darkness was their birthright. We witnessed the birth of a predator, a machine built from the ground up to do the impossible, to see in the dark. The P-61 Black Widow had arrived in the Pacific. But would it work? Or was it just a complicated, expensive theory? Tonight, we answer that question. This is the story of First Blood. The tense, shaky, and ultimately triumphant first steps of the Black Widow as it went from a secret weapon to the nightmare that stalked the South Pacific night. Strap in. The hunt is on. The men of the 421st Night Fighter Squadron were pioneers, but they weren't feeling particularly heroic in the sweltering heat of their New Guinea airstrip in May of 1944. Their beautiful, sinister Black Widows were reassembled, but they were finicky. The humid, tropical environment was hell on the sensitive radar equipment. Sand and dust clogged the massive air-cooled engines. And the pressure was immense. Every night, the familiar drone of Washing Machine Charlie, or Louis the Louse, would taunt them from the sky. The ground troops, the Marines and soldiers they were there to protect, would grumble. What are those big black planes even for? Lawn ornaments? The first few patrols were fruitless, frustrating affairs. Mechanical gremlins were the real enemy. A radar set would fail just as a contact was acquired. An engine would overheat, forcing an abort. The learning curve wasn't just steep, it was a cliff. The pilots, men like Lieutenant Herman Ernst and his radar operator, Lieutenant Ed Kopsel, had to learn a new language, a new way of flying. This wasn't about stick and rudder skills alone, it was about trust. The pilot had to trust his R/O implicitly, flying on instruments based solely on the comm instructions from the man in the back, a man staring into a glowing green screen, interpreting blips and shadows. And the R/OS? They were the wizards. Men like Sergeant Charles Crosby, who had to differentiate between ground clutter, weather returns, and the tiny, precious blip that was an enemy bomber. They were part scientist, part warrior, their world reduced to a phosphorescent glow. The tension in those early missions was a physical thing. You can imagine Lieutenant Ernst, his knuckles white on the control yoke, his eyes darting between his instrument panel and the oppressive blackness outside his canopy. Yo? Anything, Ed? Anything at all? Capsule? Negative, Skipper. Sky is clear. Just a lot of jungle fuzz down below. He's out here somewhere. I can feel it. They were hunting a ghost. And the ghost knew all the hiding places. Then, on the night of June 30th, 1944, everything changed. The crew for this historic mission was Pilot Lieutenant Dale Haberman and his radar operator, Lieutenant Ray Mooney. Their widow, a machine of oil, metal, and hope, sat on the alert strip, its engines silent. Then the air raid siren wailed. A single Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was approaching from the north. This was it. Haberman and Mooney scrambled. The Black Widow clawed its way into the night sky, a shadow detaching itself from the earth. Down below, every soldier on the ground who heard that distinctive twin-engine rumble looked up. For the first time, it wasn't just another sound of war. It was the sound of an answer. Mooney went to work immediately, his face bathed in the green light of the SEA 720 scope. Mooney Vio, pilot from our /O. I have a contact. Bearing 340. Range 10 miles. Angels 8. Haberman banked the Widow, a gentle turn to intercept. The chase was on. The Betty, oblivious, droned on towards its target. Mooney guided Haberman with a steady stream of calm corrections. Come right 5 degrees, range now 7 miles, he's level 6 miles, you're closing fast. 5 miles. You should be visual soon. Haberman strained his eyes. The night was absolute. There was no moon. He saw nothing but a blanket of stars. The tension was unbearable. Were they chasing a phantom? Was the radar playing tricks? 4 miles, Skipper. He's right ahead. And then a shape. A darker patch against the dark sky. The distinct, twin-tailed silhouette of a Betty. Haberman tally-ho. I see him. It's a Betty. The Widow crept closer, a panther stalking its prey. The Betty was still completely unaware. Haberman maneuvered into the perfect firing position, sliding in behind and below the bomber. He flipped the safety off the 420mm cannons. His thumb rested on the trigger button on his control yoke. This was the moment of truth. The entire concept of the dedicated night fighter, millions of dollars and countless man-hours of research and development, all came down to this single, visceral act. He closed to 300 feet. He could see the exhaust flames from the Betty's engines. He could almost make out the individual panels on its fuselage. He took a breath. He fired. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A concentrated stream of high-explosive shells walked up the Betty's fuselage and tore directly into its wing root. There was a brilliant, blinding flash, an explosion that lit up the entire sky for a split second, illuminating the underside of the Black Widow in a hellish orange glow. The Betty, mortally wounded, shuddered violently. A wing sheared off, and the bomber, now a comet of burning fuel and molten metal, spun into a fatal dive towards the jungle below. There was a moment of stunned silence in the Black Widow's cockpit. Then, radio discipline broke. Mooney, we got him. Dale, we got him. He's going down. He's a fireball. On the ground, the reaction was pure, unadulterated euphoria. Marines and soldiers poured out of their foxholes, whooping and cheering, watching the fireball arc across the sky and disappear behind the jungle canopy. It wasn't just a dead bomber. It was a symbol. The tormentor was dead. The night was no longer his. The first confirmed kill for the P-61 Black Widow was in the books. It was official. The Americans could now see in the dark. That first kill was a proof of concept, a shot of adrenaline for the entire night fighter program. But one kill doesn't win a war. The 421st, and soon other squadrons like the 418th and 547th, had to turn this new weapon into a reliable system of death. They had to develop the tactics that would make the Black Widow the undisputed master of the night. And develop them they did. This wasn't just about having radar, it was about how you used it. The crews of the Black Widows became artists of the intercept. The standard tactic was known as the ABC method: airborne, broadcast, control. The Widows would be airborne and orbiting in designated stacks at different altitudes, acting as a picket line. Ground-based radar stations, with their larger, more powerful sets, would broadcast vectors to the fighters, giving them a general direction. Then, the Black Widow's own onboard radar would take over for the final control and kill. But the real magic happened in the last few miles. The best crews, the aces, developed an almost psychic connection. The R/O was the quarterback, calling the plays. R/O, okay, he's at 2 miles, same altitude. Ease back on the throttle a bit, you're overtaking too fast. Come left 2 degrees, that's it, perfect. Range 1 mile. You should be visual now. The pilot's job was to fly smoothly, to avoid any sudden movements that would throw off the R/O's scope, and to trust the instructions implicitly. When he finally got a visual, the attack was methodical, cold, and brutally efficient. They would often approach from below and behind, sliding into the bomber's blind spot. The P-61 was painted gloss black, making it incredibly difficult to see against the dark sky. From this position, they could see the enemy silhouetted against the stars. It was the perfect killing position. And then came the sting. The Widow's firepower was so overwhelming that engagements were often shockingly brief. There was no extended dogfight. It was a single, surgical burst. A 2-second ripping sound, and then a fireball. Lieutenant Robert Carr and his R/O, Lieutenant James Phillips, exemplified this deadly efficiency. On one mission, they were vectored onto a Japanese Sally bomber. Phillips guided Carr into a perfect position. Carr saw the Sally cruising along, utterly unaware. He closed to 200 feet. He could see the red meatball insignia on the wing. He fired a 1-second burst. The 20mm shells literally disintegrated the Sally's tail section. The bomber nosed over and plunged into the sea. The entire engagement, from radar lock to kill, took less than 90 seconds. This was the new reality for Japanese night raiders. The safe, predictable darkness had become a hunting ground. They would take off from their bases and simply not return. No radio calls. No distress signals. Just vanished. The psychological impact on Japanese bomber crews was immense. Where before there was confidence, now there was a creeping, gnawing fear. What was out there? What was this black thing that struck from the void without warning? The Americans started giving their Black Widows names, often with a darkly humorous twist. Sleepy Time Gal, Midnight Miss, the Black Death. They were personalizing the instruments of their vengeance. But it wasn't all one-sided triumph. The Widow had its vulnerabilities. It was big, and while surprisingly agile for its size, it was no dogfighter. If a Japanese pilot ever managed to see it coming and get into a turning fight, the Widow was in trouble. There were close calls. One Widow, piloted by Lieutenant Leon Lee Lewis, was jumped by a nimble Zero that had somehow managed to get on its tail. The R/O, Lieutenant Don Roden, shouted a warning. Roden, Lee, brake left. Brake left. Bandit on R6. Lewis threw the massive Widow into a violent, gut-wrenching turn, the G-forces pushing them down into their seats. The Zero pilot, skilled and determined, stuck with them, his tracers slicing past the canopy. It was the Widow's worst nightmare. In a sheer, desperate move, Lewis firewalled the throttles and dove, using the Widow's immense weight and power to simply outrun the lighter Zero, escaping into the protective darkness. It was a stark reminder: the Widow was a specialist, an assassin. It was not a brawler. Its power was in the first, unseen strike. If that failed, it was in mortal danger. By the end of 1944, the transformation was complete. The P-61 Black Widow was no longer an experiment, it was a legend. The Charlies and Louis became fewer and farther between. The nightly terror raids that had plagued the ground troops for so long became a rarity. The Black Widow had effectively cleared the skies. The men on the ground now heard that deep, throbbing engine sound with a sense of profound relief. It was the sound of protection, the sound of a guardian. They'd look up into the blackness and say, "Go get him, Widow." The Japanese high command was baffled. Their intelligence report spoke of a new American night fighter, but their pilots who survived encounters, and few did, could offer no coherent explanation. They spoke of being attacked without warning, of a black shape that materialized from nothingness. Some attributed it to sheer bad luck. Others, to a new kind of American superweapon. Their doctrine had no answer for it. Their arrogance had blinded them to the possibility of American technological leapfrogging. The Black Widow's success was a testament to American industrial ingenuity and the courage of a new kind of aircrew. It was a victory won not just with bullets and bombs, but with oscilloscopes and magnetrons, with the calm, professional voices of radar operators guiding their pilots through the storm. But the war was moving west. The Allies were island hopping towards the Philippines, towards Iwo Jima, towards Japan itself. And the Japanese, reeling from this new threat, were not going to take it lying down. They were adapting. They were developing their own countermeasures, their own night fighters. The darkness was about to get more crowded and a lot more dangerous. The era of easy kills was ending. The Black Widow had proven it could slaughter bombers. But what would happen when the hunters became the hunted? When the Widow itself became the target? The stage was set for the next, more deadly phase of the Night War. A phase that would pit the technological marvel of the West against the desperate, fanatical ingenuity of an empire on the brink that terrified, truncated radio call was the sound of a paradigm shifting. By late 1944, the P-61 Black Widow was no longer a rumor, it was a phantom haunting the Imperial Japanese Air Force. The night, once a sanctuary, had become a slaughterhouse. American ingenuity had stolen the darkness. But the story doesn't end there. You see, in war, the enemy always adapts. They learn. They evolve. The Japanese, reeling from the Black Widow's sting, were not simply going to surrender the night. They began to change their tactics. They started sending out their own hunters. Faster, more agile fighters, stripped of weight and sent into the gloom with one mission: find the Widow and kill it. The Black Widow's reign of terror was about to be challenged. This is the story of when the assassin became the target, when the hunters became the hunted. The sheer, brutal effectiveness of the Black Widow forced the Japanese into a desperate technological and tactical scramble. Their initial response was denial, then disbelief, and finally, a grim acceptance. They had to counter this threat. First, they tried modifying their bombers. They installed crude, early warning radar sets on some aircraft. They tried flying at higher, more unpredictable altitudes. They began flying more complex routes to their targets, zigzagging to throw off pursuers. But against the sophisticated SCR-720 radar of the Black Widow, these were often just delaying tactics. A skilled R/O could still plot an intercept course. Then came the real threat. The Japanese began deploying their own night fighters. They didn't have a dedicated, radar-equipped aircraft like the Widow. What they had were ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice. Their primary weapon became the Najima J-1N1 Gecko, Moonlight, codenamed Irving by the Allies. It was a twin-engine, long-range reconnaissance plane that was modified into a night fighter. Its tactics were radically different from the Widow's. It couldn't see in the dark with radar. Instead, it relied on the incredibly sharp eyes of its crew and a terrifying, almost medieval weapon: a pair of 20mm cannons mounted to fire upwards at a 30-degree angle. The concept was diabolically simple. The Gecko would fly underneath an American bomber stream, invisible against the dark ground. The pilot or observer would look up, spot a bomber silhouetted against the stars, and slide underneath it. Then, they would simply fly formation and fire their upward-firing cannons, what the Germans called Schrägmusik, or jazz music, into the bomber's vulnerable belly. It was a devastatingly effective tactic that claimed many B-29s later in the war. And now, they were turning this weapon on the Black Widow. The first encounters between the P-61 and the J-1N1 were clashes of diametrically opposed philosophies. It was American technological supremacy versus Japanese visual acuity and sheer guts. Picture the scene. A Black Widow, let's say from the 547th Night Fighter Squadron, is prowling over the Philippines. Its crew is confident, a well-oiled team. The R/O, scanning his scope, picks up a contact. R/OVO. Pilot, I have a blip. Low about 5 miles, moving fast. Not a bomber. Profile looks like a fighter. The pilot, let's call him Captain Mike Reynolds, feels a jolt of adrenaline. This is new. Roger. Is he heading towards us? Negative. He's crossing left to right. He doesn't seem to have seen us. Reynolds banks to follow. The Widow was a big target, but it had one huge advantage in this scenario. It knew where the enemy was, and the enemy had no idea it was there. They closed in. Reynolds got a visual. The distinctive, long, glassy nose of the gecko. Tally-ho! It's an Irving. He's cruising, completely blind. They moved in for the kill. Standard procedure. Slide in behind. But just as Reynolds was about to fire, the gecko suddenly and violently rolled inverted and dove away. The Japanese crew had seen them. They had incredible night vision. The chase was on. This was the new deadly dance of the Pacific night. The Widow, with its technological eye, trying to get a missile lock in an age before missiles. The gecko, with its human eyes, trying to spot the black predator before it could strike. In some cases, the gecko turned the tables. There's a famous, harrowing account from a Widow crew who found themselves on the receiving end. They were stalking what they thought was a bomber when their R/O saw a second, faster blip detach from the ground clutter and climb towards them with terrifying speed. R/OVO. Bandit. Bandit. 6 o'clock low, climbing fast. Brake right. Brake right. The pilot slammed the Widow into a hard turn. Tracers, not the familiar American red-orange, but the greenish-white of Japanese ammunition, zipped past their wing. Anama Ki-45, Nick, heavy fighter, another aircraft pressed into night fighting service, had been waiting for them, using the Widow's own attack run as a chance to pounce. The Widow was now in a desperate, close-range knife fight in a phone booth. It was the scenario they dreaded. The Ki-45 was more maneuverable. The Widow pilot, using raw power and a cool head, stood the aircraft on its wing, firewalled the throttles, and used a diving spiral to escape, the G-forces making the crew gray out. They lived to fight another day, but it was a stark, sweat-soaked lesson. The night was no longer theirs alone. It was in this new, more dangerous environment that the true legends of the Black Widow were forged. The men who rose to the top weren't just good pilots. They were masters of their unique, complex weapon system. They became the aces of darkness. The first and most famous P-61 ace was Captain Paul A. Smith of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron. Smith and his stellar radar operator, Lieutenant Robert Tierney, were the perfect embodiment of the Widow's hunter-killer team. They developed an almost supernatural synergy. One night over Leyte, they were vectored onto a Betty bomber. Smith and Tierney closed in flawlessly. But as Smith was about to fire, the Betty's rear gunner spotted them and opened up with his 20mm tail cannon. Tracers streaked past the Widow's canopy. Most pilots would have broken off, evaded, and tried again. Not Paul Smith. In a move of breathtaking audacity, he held his course. He ignored the incoming fire. He kept the Pipper, the gun sight, steadied on the Betty's fuselage. He was a rock. He trusted his aircraft to absorb any hits, and he trusted his own aim to end the fight before it began. He fired a single, half-second burst. The cannon shells ripped the Betty apart. It was a display of ice-cold nerves that became the stuff of squadron legend. But Smith and Tierney's most legendary exploit was a double kill that showcased the Widow's raw power and their own incredible skill. On the night of December 29, 1944, they were sent to intercept a raid on their base. They found not one, but two Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers flying in formation. Tierney guided Smith into a perfect position on the lead bomber. A quick burst sent it spinning down in flames. The second bomber, now aware of the threat, began violent evasive maneuvers. It was a tough target, twisting and turning in the dark. But Tierney was a wizard on the scope. He kept the blip locked, his voice calm as he fed corrections to Smith. Tierney, he's turning hard left, range increasing, come left, that's it. Now he's rolling out. Range closing. 1,000 feet, you're on him. Fire. Smith fired. Another short, devastating burst. The second sally exploded. 2 kills in a matter of minutes. Paul Smith had just become the first P-61 ace, and he did it in spectacular fashion. But the aces weren't just the pilots. The radar operators were heroes in their own right. Men like Master Sergeant Charles Crosby of the 548th NFS, who was so good he was often borrowed by other crews for important missions. Crosby had an almost intuitive feel for the radar, able to distinguish between a rain cloud and a bomber at extreme range. He was credited with multiple assists that were, in reality, kills he had directed. These men, pilots and our /OS alike, battled not just the enemy, but extreme fatigue. The mental strain of a night mission was immense. Hours of boredom, staring into a tiny green screen or an infinite blackness, punctuated by moments of sheer, pants-wetting terror. They lived on coffee and adrenaline, their sleep schedules permanently reversed. They were a brotherhood of vampires, bound by a shared secret. They were the ones who stole the night back. By the spring of 1945, the air war over the Pacific had changed irrevocably. The P-61 Black Widow had not only stopped the Japanese night offensive, it had dominated it. It had forced the enemy to expend precious resources and skilled pilots in a desperate and largely futile attempt to counter it. The Black Widow squadrons had moved ever closer to Japan itself, operating from Iwo Jima and eventually Okinawa. From these bases, they began flying long-range intruder missions, hunting not just bombers, but anything that moved under the cover of darkness. Transport aircraft, freighters, even trains. The Widow was no longer just a defender, it was taking the war directly to the enemy's doorstep. But the price of this dominance was eternal vigilance. Every mission was now a potential ambush. The Japanese were getting bolder. Their night fighters, though less technologically advanced, were flown by pilots with nothing left to lose, men willing to ram an American aircraft if given the chance. The stress on the Widow crews was immense. You can imagine them, sitting in their ready rooms before a mission, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The easy confidence of 1944 was gone, replaced by the grim professionalism of veterans who knew exactly what they were flying into. They would joke, they would play cards, but their eyes would constantly flick towards the door, waiting for the scramble order. The final, greatest test of the Black Widow was looming. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall. In this apocalyptic scenario, the Black Widow's role would have been more critical than ever, to protect the invasion fleet from nightly attacks by kamikazes and bombers, a duty that would have pitted them against the most fanatical and desperate attacks of the entire war. The Widow was ready. Its crews were ready. They had proven themselves against bombers, against fighters, against everything the Japanese could throw at them. They had turned the tide. But the war was about to take another shocking turn. A turn that would come not from the darkness of the night, but from a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The Black Widow had won its war. But the world was about to change in ways none of them could have ever imagined. News announcer. And so, the Empire of Japan has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over. Repeat, the war is over. August 15, 1945. VJ Day. The sound of a world breathing a sigh of relief. For the men of the Black Widow squadrons, scattered across captured islands in the Pacific, the news was met with a complex storm of emotions. Elation, disbelief, an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. And for some, a strange, quiet anticlimax. We've followed their story from desperate birth, to first blood, to the deadly crucible where they were both hunter and hunted. They had done it. They had conquered the night. They had proven the doubters wrong and had given the enemy a terror they never saw coming. But what happens to a weapon when the war it was built for suddenly ends? What is the legacy of a predator in a world at peace? This is the final chapter of our story. The story of the quiet after the storm, the long journey home, and the indelible mark the Black Widow and its crews left on history. In the weeks following the surrender, the frantic pace of war gave way to the slow, bureaucratic machinery of peace. For the Black Widow crews, the shift was jarring. One night, you're stalking a Betty over Tokyo Bay, your heart pounding, your hands slick on the controls. The next, you're filling out paperwork, counting supply crates, and waiting for a ship back to a country you haven't seen in years. The Black Widows themselves were suddenly obsolete. Not because they were ineffective, but because the world had leaped forward. The dawn of the jet age was upon them. Sleek, faster aircraft like the P-80 Shooting Star made the big, propeller-driven Widow look like a relic. The sophisticated radar that had been their lifeblood was now being miniaturized and improved for a new generation of fighters. It was a tough pill to swallow. These men had bonded with their aircraft. They knew every creak, every rumble, every quirk of their specific Widow. They had trusted their lives to them in the most extreme conditions imaginable. And now they were to be simply scrapped? It felt like a betrayal. Pilot Lieutenant James Postlethwaite of the 548th wrote in a letter home. Postlethwaite, oh, read with a wistful tone. They're parking the Widows in long rows at the edge of the airstrip. They look like a flock of sleeping bats in the daylight. It's strange to see them so still and silent. It's the end of an era, and a part of me is sad to see it go. We did something important with these planes. I hope people remember. And that was the fear that they would be forgotten. That their war, the war of the night, of blips on a screen and voices in the dark, would be overshadowed by the epic carrier battles and the daring daytime bomber raids. The journey home was a long, slow voyage of reflection. The crews of the P-61, this unique band of brothers, pilots, our/OS and ground crew, who had spoken a language only they understood, began to disperse. They shared one last beer on the troop ship, promised to write, and stepped back into an America that was rushing headlong into the future. They were civilians again. But the war didn't just leave them with memories. It left its mark. Many struggled with what we now call PTSD. The sound of a certain kind of engine, the smell of oil and ozone, the pitch black of a country night, it could all bring them right back to the cockpit over Rabaul or Iwo Jima. They had been young men tasked with an impossible job, and they had carried its weight in the silence of their own hearts for decades. So, were they forgotten? In the public consciousness, perhaps. The P-61 never achieved the iconic status of the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress. But in the annals of military history and technological evolution, their impact was nothing short of revolutionary. The Black Widow was the proof of concept. It was the first. It demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that the era of the visual dogfight was over. The future of air combat was in beyond visual range engagement. It was in sensors and data links and electronic warfare. The P-61 was the great-grandfather of the F-14 Tomcat, the F-15 Eagle, and the F-35 Lightning II. Every time a modern fighter pilot locks onto a target dozens of miles away with radar, they are using the tactical DNA first written in the cockpit of a Black Widow. The partnership between pilot and radar operator established the model for the modern weapons systems officer, the Wizzo, or backseater, in two-seat fighters. It validated the idea that complex warfare required specialists working in concert. But beyond the cold, hard facts of military evolution, the story of the Black Widow carries a deeper, more human moral. It's a story about the power of innovation in the face of overwhelming odds. Remember the scoffing, the skepticism the Widow faced at the beginning? You're going to fight in that? It's a story that screams, never underestimate the underdog. The Japanese underestimated American technological resilience. They wrote off American creativity as mere imitation. And in doing so, they created their own worst nightmare. The Black Widow stands as a permanent testament to a simple, brutal truth. Arrogance is a fatal flaw. It blinds you to the possibilities, to the ingenuity of your opponent. It's a lesson that echoes far beyond the coral airstrips of the Pacific. It's a lesson for the businessman who dismisses a startup, for the athlete who overlooks an opponent, for anyone who rests on their laurels and believes their dominance is a permanent state. The P-61 Black Widow is history's reminder that the landscape can change in an instant, and the weapon you never saw coming is often the one that ends the fight. Today, only a handful of P-61 Black Widows remain. You can see them in museums, like the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center, suspended in silent tribute. They look almost delicate under the bright lights, their gloss black paint showing every scratch, every rivet. It's hard to imagine the thunder of their engines, the smell of cordite, the fierce concentration of their crews. But if you stand there long enough, and you listen closely past the hushed voices of tourists, you can almost hear it. The ghost of a radar's hum. The calm, steady voice of a young man from Ohio or Texas guiding his pilot through the void. The brief, ripping sound of cannons. The triumphant, relieved shout after a kill. These men, now old, their hair white, their steps slower, they still carry those nights with them. They are the guardians of a fading memory. When one of them passes, a little more of that history, that first-hand account of what it was like to be a nighttime assassin, slips away into the darkness they once ruled. So the next time you find yourself outside on a clear, dark night, look up. Look up at the stars. And remember that there was a time, not so long ago, when that very darkness was a battlefield. When the fate of soldiers on the ground, and perhaps the course of a world war, rested on the shoulders of a few hundred young men in a strange, black aircraft, armed with a secret weapon their enemy could never comprehend. They were the aces of darkness. They were the crews of the P-61 Black Widow. And they stole the night back. This has been the story of how American ingenuity and courage turned the tide in the Pacific night. Thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe for more stories of the triumphs and tragedies that shaped our world. Until next time, decades fall away like pages from a calendar. The war is a memory, preserved in black and white photographs and the lined faces of old men. The thunder of the Widow's engines is silent. But its echo never truly faded. We've told the story of the war. But the story of the Black Widow doesn't end with the scrapyards of 1945. Its spirit, the very DNA of its revolutionary concept, didn't die, it evolved. It went underground, transferred from the oil-stained hands of Northrop mechanics to the starched white coats of engineers in secret hangars in the Nevada desert. The P-61 was the end of the beginning. It proved that a fighter didn't need to see its prey with human eyes. It proved that a kill could be orchestrated by a team, guided by invisible waves. This was a genie that could not be put back in the bottle. The question was no longer if you could fight in the dark, but how much better, faster, and deadlier you could make the hunter. This is the final, untold chapter. The story of the Widow's children. The legacy that flies today, in the silent, unseen reaches of the sky. Before the war was even over, the minds at Northrop were already dreaming of what came next. The P-61's successor wasn't just another iteration, it was a quantum leap. It was the Northrop F-89 Scorpion. Look at it. You can see the family resemblance, the twin-tail booms, the robust fuselage. But the Scorpion was bigger, faster, and armed with a terrifying new weapon, the Air-2 Genie, an unguided nuclear rocket. Its mission? To stalk and destroy entire formations of Soviet nuclear bombers in the Arctic night. The Scorpion wasn't just a night fighter, it was an interceptor, a guardian of the continental United States during the darkest days of the Cold War. The Black Widow's task of point defense had been scaled up to the defense of a nation. But the true spiritual successor, the aircraft that fully embraced the Widow's core philosophy of sensor-based assassination, was the legendary F-108 Rapier. This was Jack Northrop's ultimate vision. A long-range, Mach 3 interceptor designed to loiter for hours on the fringes of the Arctic, its powerful radar scanning hundreds of miles, ready to launch long-range missiles at Soviet bombers long before they ever reached American shores. It was the ultimate expression of the find and kill doctrine the P-61 pioneered. Though the Rapier was cancelled, its technology, its very soul, fed directly into one of the most formidable aircraft ever built. The State Route 71 Blackbird. The connection is real, and it's direct. The same company, the same visionary thinking, the same desire to own the sky through superior technology. And this philosophy culminated in the aircraft that sits at the pinnacle of air dominance today, the F-35 Lightning II. Think about it. What is the F-35's greatest strength? It's not its speed or its maneuverability alone. It's its sensors. It's the ability to gather, fuse, and share information, to see the battlefield with a god's eye view, and to eliminate threats before they are even aware of its presence. The pilot of an F-35 is the modern evolution of the P-61 crew. He is both the pilot and the radar operator, his helmet allowing him to look through the floor of his aircraft, his displays showing him a synthesized, perfect picture of the battle space. The P-61's green, glowing scope has been replaced by a panoramic touchscreen, but the mission is identical. See first. Shoot first. Kill first. The Black Widow's black paint wasn't just for show. It was an early, crude form of stealth, reducing its visual signature. That idea, born in the 1940s, grew into the radar-absorbent materials and faceted angles of the F-117 Nighthawk, and then into the smooth, curved surfaces of the B-2 Spirit bomber, another Northrop creation. The lineage is unbroken. The desire to move unseen, to strike from the shadows, it's the same predatory instinct, refined over 3/4 of a century. But what of the men? For the veterans of the Black Widow squadrons, coming home was a different kind of mission, one with no briefing and no clear objective. They traded the adrenaline-soaked fear of the cockpit for the quiet confusion of peace. Many, like Lieutenant Herman Ernst, who we met earlier, simply went back to their old lives. He became a mailman in Ohio. Can you imagine it? Walking a quiet suburban route, the morning sun on your face, after spending years as a lord of the night, a killer of men from 10,000 feet? The dichotomy must have been staggering. They didn't talk about it much. Not at first. The world was eager to move on, to forget the war. Their stories were locked away, like the manuals for the S-720 radar, classified and gathering dust. They became members of the P-61 Black Widow Crewmen Association, finding solace only with the few other men on the planet who understood what that deep-throated engine rumble truly meant. Their reunions were a sight to behold. Old pilots, their hands now shaky, would pantomime the controls for young historians. Radar operators, their eyesight faded, would point at static-filled photos and say, "There, that's the blip. Right there. That's the one we got over Lady." They kept the memory alive, not for glory, but for each other. For the brotherhood. And then, there were the losses that continued long after the guns fell silent. The slow fade of friends, the final flight of a comrade. With each passing, a unique, first-hand perspective on one of history's most unique combat experiences vanished forever. They became, themselves, fading blips on the scope of history. In 2024, the number of P-61 veterans who can still tell their story firsthand can be counted on one hand. They are the last living links to that black aircraft and its secret war. But their legacy is secure. It flies every time an F-22 Raptor pilot, using her radar to lock a target 100 miles away, trusts the data on her screen more than her own eyes. It flies in the silent, orbiting vigilance of drones, the ultimate expression of remote, sensor-driven warfare. The P-61 was the seed from which this entire forest of technology grew. So, the next time you see a modern fighter jet at an air show, or read about the latest advancements in radar technology, remember the Black Widow. Remember the young men who climbed into that awkward, powerful beast when it was just a theory, a gamble. They took a radical idea into the darkest corners of the sky and proved that courage, when paired with ingenuity, can change the very nature of war. They were the first to truly master the night. They were the weavers of the first electronic web. And long after the last of them is gone, and the last museum widow is silent, their legacy will continue to fly, an eternal vigil in the digital darkness. This concludes our series. Japanese never expected radar to turn P-61 Black Widows into nighttime assassins. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows. These stories of courage and innovation must never be forgotten. Share them. Honor them, lest we forget.